Okay, let's unpack this. When we talk about democracy, we often picture that classic ideal government by the people, for the people. It feels like everyone gets a direct say, or, at least the representatives faithfully channel their will.
Hmm.
But the stack of sources we have for this deep dive, these notes, academic excerpts, research snippets, they offer a much more complex, sometimes frankly, unsettling picture of what democracy actually looks like, especially in the messy reality of modern societies.
That's absolutely right. Traditional political theory often wrestled with the philosophical justifications for democracy, why it's ethically good, or the ideal form of government. But this material shows how thinkers looking at the world through a sociological and, well, critical lens started asking a different question. Forget the ideal for a second. What is democracy actually doing? Who really holds power? How are decisions really made?
Right.
This shift from the ethical ideal to the observed reality is what contemporary theories are all about, and it leads to some surprisingly sharp conclusions.
Absolutely. So our mission today is to jump into this fascinating landscape of modern democratic thought. We're going to look at theories that suggest power is actually concentrated in the hands of a few, theories that see it as a constant tug of war between different groups.
Hmm.
And then we'll explore the pushback ideas that call for more active citizen power, theories that put economic class right at the center of the debate, and even those that focus on the very process of public discussion itself.
Think of it as getting a new pair of glasses for understanding the political world. Why does policy often seem to favor certain groups? Does your vote truly hold the weight you think it does?
Exactly.
These theories provide frameworks to look beyond the headlines and see the underlying power dynamics at play. It's a shortcut to being well-informed, yes, but maybe more importantly, a shortcut to understanding the fundamental debates about who rules and why.
Right. Let's dive in with the challenge that really kicked off a lot of this modern thinking. The traditional idea is government of the people. Simple enough. But sociological observations seem to suggest that wasn't the reality on the ground.
Yeah, not quite.
Power appeared concentrated in the hands of a few, almost regardless of the formal political structure. This observation, as our sources detail, was the seed of elitist theory.
Yes. The sources highlight that the shift was from focusing on democracy as a form of government and its ethical basis to examining its nature in light of sociological findings. And the elitist perspective is one of the earliest and most direct challenges based on this empirical observation.
And the core idea is pretty stark, isn't it? Every society, big or small, is fundamentally divided into the elite, a minority with a significant influence, and the masses, the majority who are governed by that elite.
Mm.
It's not just about who gets elected, it's presented as a deep social reality.
That's the key premise. Thinkers like Gaetano Mosca, writing way back in the late 19th century, argued in the ruling class that this division is necessary. There are always rulers and ruled. Full stop.
Always.
According to Mosca, yes. And crucially, this ruling class controls wealth, power, and prestige, and exercises all power in society, irrespective of whether the government is called a monarchy or a republic. He was, well, quite skeptical that the ruled could ever truly replace them.
So the label you put on your government doesn't actually change the fundamental power dynamic. That's a serious challenge to conventional thinking.
It is a huge challenge. And his contemporary, Robert Muckles, added fuel to this fire with his famous concept, the iron law of oligarchy.
Ah, the iron law. I've heard of that.
Right. Michel studied organizations, particularly political parties, which were ostensibly democratic, right? But he concluded that every organization, no matter its goals, inevitably develops into an oligarchy ruled by a small, select group.
An oligarchy being a small, chosen few.
Precisely. And his reasoning, as noted in the source, was quite pessimistic about human nature and the mechanics of organization. He attributed it to the manipulative skills of leaders, combined with what he saw as apathy, indolence, and a fundamental incapacity for self-government among the majority.
Oof.
Yeah. He felt most people are simply more comfortable following.
Ouch. Incapable of self-government and slavish. Those are harsh words. Does this apply everywhere? Is my local, gardening club doomed to be run by an oligarchy?
Well, Michels argued it was a universal tendency in organized life. The source material points to political parties as a prime example where a leadership elite consolidates power. While maybe not as stark in your gardening club, the principle suggests that the dynamics of organization itself tend to lead to power being held by fewer hands than the total membership.
Mm.
Vilfredo Pareto also contributed significantly, being the first, according to the source, to formally use the terms elite and masses. He defined elite simply as those with the highest ability in their field. Yeah, highest ability. Seeing the masses as lacking leadership qualities, fearing responsibility, and, well, feeling safer following the elite.
So Pareto links it more to innate ability and maybe a psychological comfort with followership. Less about economic structures, perhaps.
Yeah, less about conspiracy or economic power explicitly in his formulation, more about natural differentiation in skills and preferences.
The source says that, taken together, these early elitist theories essentially argued that democracy, in the pure sense of government of the people, seemed empirically impossible to realize, just couldn't happen in practice.
That was the uncomfortable conclusion they presented. They looked at the data of social organization and power distribution and said, look, the reality is minority rule. Faced with this powerful challenge, some democratic thinkers tried to salvage the concept of democracy by redefining it to accommodate elite rule.
Okay.
This is where we get democratic elitism or elitist democratic theory.
Okay, so it's not saying democracy is impossible, but that we need a different, maybe more realistic understanding of it.
Exactly. Karl Mannheim, for example, argued that society doesn't lose its democratic character simply because policy is made by elites. Direct, continuous participation isn't practical, he reasoned. That's just not feasible in large societies.
Makes sense.
But what is crucial is that the people can make their aspirations felt at intervals.
Like at election time.
Exactly. Mannheim believed this periodic ability of the governed to remove leaders or compel them to act in their interest was sufficient for a functioning democracy. He also hoped for selection by merit and reducing the distance between elites and the masses, though the source doesn't really detail how that latter part might be achieved.
That idea of sufficient participation is a big pivot, isn't it? Is just voting periodically truly enough? That's the million-dollar question, I suppose.
It's a question that continues to be debated, for sure. Joseph A. Schumpeter offered perhaps the most famous and influential answer to this. In his book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, he basically bypassed the traditional definition of democracy entirely. He defined it purely by its method.
Its method.
Yes. The institutional arrangement for arriving at political decisions in which individuals acquire the power to decide by means of a competitive struggle for the people's votes. That's the quote from the source.
The competitive struggle for votes. That sounds very much like how we talk about politics today, like politicians competing for market share.
That's precisely the analogy. Decisions are made by leaders, and they gain the right to decide through free competition for votes. The people's role, well, it's reduced to choosing between these competing elites. The source points out that the saving grace here, maybe, is that this competition means leaders can't ignore public opinion entirely. They have to earn votes. They need that electoral support.
But the downside is the initiative remains with the leadership. The people are essentially consumers, just responding to the political products offered in this political market. Feels a bit passive.
It's a very procedural, minimalist view. Democracy is reduced to a mechanism for selecting rulers. Then you have Raymond Aron, who brought in the idea of a plurality of elites as a key feature of liberal democracy.
Plurality, meaning more than one.
Exactly. He contrasted the single, unified elite of a totalitarian state like the Soviet Union back then with the multiple competing elites in the West. You know, political elites, economic elites, cultural elites, and so on. This plurality, he argued, forces compromise and makes those in power sensitive to opposition and public opinion because their position is precarious. They know they can be challenged.
So it's not just one elite, but a competition among different elites that makes it democratic, or at least more responsive.
The source notes that this plurality forces compromise and makes leaders more responsive. But even here, the initiative largely stays with the elites. The masses influence primarily through selection and pressure, not really initiation. Still quite a passive role for the majority.
And Giovanni Sartori seems to double down on this. The source quotes him saying the elite's role is the core of democracy, not a deviation, and that the idea of a self-governing people is a delusion. Pretty strong words.
Sartori is quite blunt. He argues that effective government requires competent leaders, and the real danger isn't leadership itself, but its absence, which could allow anti-democratic counter-elites to gain power by exploiting the masses. He even suggests leaders have a role in educating public opinion.
which can sound quite paternalistic, maybe?
It certainly can. So the democratic elitist view, in its various forms, accepts elite rule as inevitable, or at least a practical reality, and defines democracy by the mechanisms like competitive elections that allow masses to choose or constrain those elites periodically.
That's the fundamental concession and redefinition, yeah.
Building on the idea of multiple elites, some pluralist theories shifted focus slightly to the plurality of groups. Not just elites, but organized groups.
Ah, this is the pluralist theory, focusing on bargaining among groups. I think people encounter this idea a lot.
Exactly. While some pluralism is elitist, focusing on the plurality of elites like Aaron did, other forms, championed by figures like A.F. Bentley, see democracy as a continuous process of bargaining and negotiation among relatively autonomous groups.
Like different interest groups constantly lobbying the government, unions, corporations, environmental groups, that sort of thing.
Yes, exactly like that. The source describes the government's role as being the focal point for public pressure, essentially making policies that reflect the highest common group demand after all the lobbying and negotiation is done. Society is seen as differentiated, with many groups wielding different types of influence, and the management of public affairs is shared among them.
Robert Dahl's model of polyarchy fits this, right?
Yeah.
Rule by many, meaning many groups or factions.
Yes. The source explicitly links polyarchy to group theory. It describes a system where power isn't concentrated in one center, but dispersed among multiple competing groups. This pluralism is seen as a sociological description of modern society, how things actually work.
So policy isn't the will of an elite, or even the majority necessarily, but the outcome of interaction and bargaining among all the groups interested in a particular issue. And the success of a group depends on its resources, its organization, how loud it shouts, maybe, its intensity of participation.
Precisely. The source gives the example of producers often dominating over consumers because producers think industry associations are typically better organized and more vocal than, say, consumer advocacy groups.
You see that play out in all sorts of policy debates. Agriculture subsidies, financial regulations, environmental rules. The organized groups often have an outsized voice, don't they?
It's a clear consequence of the pluralist model of policymaking. The source points out that this perspective challenges both traditional majority rule and strict elitism. Policy is made neither by representatives of a coherent majority nor by an autonomous elite, but through the dynamic interaction of competing groups.
And here's that provocative point again, which you mentioned earlier. The source suggests this could mean the form of government, the specific institutions, might be less significant than the underlying dynamics of group power and lobbying.
It definitely raises the question, does changing the voting system matter as much as changing how powerful groups are? If policy is primarily a result of group pressure, then, well, maybe not as much as we think.
Let's pause and look at the critique of these elitist and pluralist theories from the source. Because they describe a reality, but is it a reality we should just accept?
Good point. On the positive side, the source acknowledges their crucial contribution in bringing an empirical dimension to democratic theory, forcing thinkers to look at how power actually functions in society, drawing heavily on sociology. Elitists saw policy made by elites, subject to popular approval or rejection. Pluralists saw it as decentralized bargaining.
And the source sees pluralists as maybe a bit more optimistic.
Yes, moving away from the potential authoritarian implications of pure elite rule. But, and this is a significant critique mentioned in the source, both arrive at conclusions far removed from the essence of democratic theory, presumably, that original ideal of true self-governance by the people.
Right. The essence gets lost somewhere in the description of reality.
Yes. And the critique goes deeper. The source argues that the observed domination isn't just about natural differences or better organization. It's often profoundly linked to economic disparities. Wealth translates directly into political influence. Money talks, basically.
Ah, linking economic power to political power, a key theme we'll definitely see again.
Exactly. The source suggests that these theories, by focusing on inherent traits or organizational dynamics instead of economic structures, tend to justify the status quo of domination. They explain how it happens without adequately critiquing why it might be unjust.
So they become descriptive rather than critical.
In a way, yes. The source posits that transforming the economic structure, ensuring rewards are based on work rather than privilege or manipulation, is necessary to eliminate this domination and realize the essence of democracy equality based on reason.
That critique of justifying the status quo and overlooking economic power is a crucial pivot, isn't it? It suggests these theories might describe reality but fail to challenge its fundamental injustices. It really sets the stage for the next set of theories.
It absolutely sets the stage for theories that are less descriptive and more prescriptive about fundamental social change. If elitist and pluralist theories accept or redefine democracy based on limited citizen roles, the participatory democracy theory is a direct call for more citizen power, a reaction against that passive model.
It comes from the feeling that in big representative democracies, citizens become passive after elections, right?
Yeah.
And there's a growing distance between people and their representatives. You vote, then you kind of switch off until the next election.
Yes, the source highlights the sense of detachment in large states like India or the US. The core concept of democracy places ultimate authority with the people, but representative systems, while necessary for scale, can lead to this low level of active engagement.
And participatory theorists explicitly reject the idea that low participation is acceptable or, inevitable. They push back hard.
Absolutely. They critique the models like Schumpeter's, where government is for professionals and citizens just vote, or Dahl's, which is reconciled with low participation. The source quotes C.B. Macpherson, who sharply criticized this approach for reducing democracy from a humanist aspiration to a mere market equilibrium system.
Humanist aspiration versus market equilibrium.
Yeah, he saw it as a mechanism focused on managing society rather than empowering people.
That contrast is powerful. It implies that low participation models miss the whole point of democracy as a means for human development and emancipation for becoming better citizens.
That's precisely the argument. The core idea of participatory democracy, as the source defines it, is that political participation by the people is the basic principle. It's about individuals and groups actively involved in the governmental processes that affect their lives, not just voting, but taking an active role in formulating and implementing policies.
So it's a much more hands-on, continuous form of engagement than just election day. It's ongoing involvement.
Yes. And the source traces this idea way back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, considered a pioneer of popular sovereignty.
Rousseau, who famously argued that sovereignty originates and is retained by the people, and that it cannot be represented because it cannot be alienated. You can't just hand over your power.
Exactly. For Rousseau, deputies are merely agents of the people's will, not independent representatives who can do whatever they want. The government is an instrument of the general will, what the source defines as the common interest of the community, the true interest of each individual when thinking collectively.
Right.
He believed the people must constantly deliberate on policy and hold their government accountable, replacing it if it deviates.
That's an incredibly demanding model of citizenship. It implies constant political engagement from everyone. And the source breaks down the various forms of political participation, showing it's a really wide spectrum.
It certainly is. The source categorizes participation as a two-way process. It can be citizen-initiated or government-initiated, and distinguishes between conventional and unconventional methods.
Conventional being the widely recognized sort of normal methods.
Right. Things like voting, campaigning, running for office, or working on local community projects like neighborhood safety or cleanup. There's also citizen-initiated contact, reaching out to officials by phone, letter, or email.
Things most people would see as standard political activity.
Yes. Then there's initiative, where citizens can propose laws through petition. Recall, allowing voters to remove elected officials before their term is up. Public hearings, where officials solicit public comments. Advisory councils of citizens offering expertise. And referendum, where voters directly approve or reject laws. The source notes it's compulsory for constitutional changes in Australia and used extensively in Switzerland.
Okay, so those are the conventional routes, and then the unconventional forms, which are less standard, sometimes less accepted by the powers that be.
Yes. This includes actions like signing a petition, attending demonstrations, joining protest marches, forming human chains. In non-democratic contexts, the source mentions passive resistance, civil disobedience, and satyagraha fall here. Protest itself encompasses strikes, hunger strikes, picketing, boycotts, using banners, slogans, and refusing honors. Civil disobedience is specifically the open, intentional breaking of an unjust law to draw attention to it. Think Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr.
And at the extreme end, the source includes political violence, listing things like bombing, assassination, riots, property damage.
The source includes this as an extreme form of unconventional protest. The spectrum is important because it shows the vast array of ways citizens can try to influence decisions, ranging from quiet, accepted methods to disruptive, sometimes dangerous, controversial ones. What society deems unconventional often depends heavily on a political climate and the nature of the regime.
Makes sense. So why argue for more participation? What are the benefits supposed to be? The source lists several justifications offered by advocates.
Yes, proponents argue that the low participation common in representative democracy leads to significant problems. Low public knowledge and understanding of issues, voter indifference, representatives becoming unaccountable or detached, and ultimately increased potential for corruption and abuse of power.
And more participation is seen as the remedy for all that.
The argument is that it leads to more thorough discussion of issues, keeps a stricter watch on politicians, and helps prevent corruption and abuse of power. Fundamentally, participation is seen as necessary and essential for creating a good society.
And the source breaks down the motivations for why people might participate into three main types.
That's right. First, the instrumental justification. People participate because it's a tool to promote or defend their own interests. It's practical. They calculate the benefits and costs.
So it's strategic, maybe self-interested participation. What's in it for me?
That's the idea behind the instrumental view. Second, the developmental educational justification. Participation is seen as enhancing citizens' moral, social, and political awareness. It helps build better, more engaged citizens through the act of participating itself.
Like civic learning by doing.
Yeah.
You get better at being a citizen by being involved.
Exactly. Third, the communitarian justification. Participation contributes to the common good, fostering a sense of shared purpose and community responsibility. It's about building the community together.
These motivations don't have to be exclusive, right? Someone could participate for a mix of reasons, surely.
Oh, absolutely. While the source presents them distinctly for analytical purposes, in the real world, people's reasons are often layered. You might attend a town hall because you're worried about a local issue affecting your home, that's instrumental, but also because you feel a sense of civic duty, communitarian, and find the process of hearing different views educational, developmental.
Makes sense. But how can you actually achieve this kind of high-level participatory democracy in large, complex states? It seems like a huge challenge logistically.
The source suggests a couple of practical methods. One is decentralization of administration, moving decision-making power down to local communities. It cites India's Panchayati Raj system as an example.
Giving more power to local levels.
Exactly. Another is the extensive use of referendum, like in Switzerland, which combines direct democracy elements where people vote on specific issues with representative structures.
The source also briefly links participatory ideas to socialism, particularly in the context of historical communist states. How did that connection work?
Yes. The source notes that socialist thinkers used participatory ideas partly as a response to the elitist critique that leadership was inevitable, which seemed to rule out a truly classless society. While figures like Lenin accepted the idea of a vanguard elite, the Communist Party, the stated goal was to bridge the gap between this vanguard and the masses through active participation and making leaders responsive.
So things like Mao's mass line or calling states people's republics.
Exactly. Those concepts and terms were presented as ways to symbolize and encourage this connection between the party elite and the people they claim to represent through mass participation.
Okay. But the source doesn't just praise participatory democracy. It also provides a critical appraisal, raising some significant potential downsides.
That's right. The source notes that advocates usually propose increasing participation within existing liberal systems, using available tools like referendums or decentralization, rather than suggesting entirely new structures. They see it as a call to action within the current framework.
But the main critique from the source is that proponents might be too optimistic, maybe overly idealistic.
That's the core of the critique. The source questions whether participation can be significantly increased across the board and suggests that too much participation might actually be harmful.
Harmful? How so? That seems counterintuitive to the democratic ideal.
Well, the source raises concerns that ordinary people might lack the necessary patience and insight for complex policies, whose benefits may be long-term or require short-term burdens on some groups for the overall public interest. It takes time and expertise, perhaps.
Okay, the complexity argument.
And more significantly, it warns that excessive participation, particularly through unconventional means like large protests, could lead to grievances spilling into the streets, disrupting normal life.
The potential for chaos and disruption if everyone is constantly mobilized.
Exactly. The source notes that excited crowds can be hard to control and might lead to property damage or worse. It also raises the concern that those skilled at mobilizing crowds, maybe demagogues, might get unreasonable demands met, while more measured, peaceful approaches from less organized groups are ignored.
So the critique is that while the ideal of active, engaged citizens is compelling, the practical reality of high-level, passionate, widespread engagement might be inefficient, disruptive, and potentially empower manipulators over thoughtful deliberation. A real tension there.
That's a significant counterargument presented in the source's critique, highlighting the tension between the democratic ideal and the challenges of its practical implementation in a large, diverse, and complex society.
This leads us neatly to a theory that focuses very heavily on the structural inequalities hinted at in the critique of elitism and pluralism, the Marxist theory of democracy. This feels like a major shift in perspective.
Yes, this shifts the focus dramatically. While liberal theories look at procedures and institutions and pluralists look at group dynamics, the Marxist view evaluates democracy primarily based on its class character. Who benefits economically?
And their core critique of liberal democracy, which they famously call bourgeois democracy, is that it fundamentally serves the interests of the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie. It's a tool for them.
Absolutely. The source cites the famous line from Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto. The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie.
That's such a powerful and enduring image, the state, as simply a tool for the ruling economic class.
Yes. And the source then elaborates on 4 reasons, drawn from thinkers influenced by Marx, for viewing liberal democracy essentially as a sham.
Okay, what are they?
1. Wealth inequality equals power inequality. The rich have disproportionate influence because they can afford better education, access powerful networks, fund campaigns, and secure positions of authority.
Money buys influence. Check.
2. Large organizations centralize power. In any complex system, including political parties or bureaucracies, power naturally gravitates to the leaders, not the broad membership.
The iron law, again, basically.
Echoes of it, yes. 3. Social inequality alienates elites. Even leaders who come from modest backgrounds tend to adopt the attitudes and perspectives of the privileged classes they join, losing touch with their origins and the people they supposedly represent.
They co-opted.
That's the idea. And 4, information control. The wealthy and powerful are better positioned to access information, fund media outlets, and control the flow and distribution of information, effectively shaping public discourse and opinion.
These critiques about money in politics, bureaucratic power, elite detachment, and media control feel incredibly relevant even today. You hear echoes of them constantly.
They are persistent critiques of liberal systems, absolutely. The source notes that some might suggest, okay, what if we remove economic inequality within capitalism? Could that make liberal democracy a true democracy? But Marxists, as the source states, are convinced that democracy and capitalism fundamentally cannot coexist. Their critique goes to the core nature of the capitalist system itself.
So because capitalist production is inherently organized to serve the bourgeoisie's profit motive, the political system built upon it, the political superstructure, is structurally incapable of serving the interests of the majority, the working class, the proletariat.
Exactly. The source emphasizes the fundamental conflict, the diametrically opposed interest between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. It argues that political power is merely a handmaid of economic power. Liberal democracy, while using the idea of sovereignty of the people for legitimacy through things like voting, actually operates primarily to preserve the conditions necessary for the capitalist market mechanism that benefits the few.
And it creates ideological misconceptions along the way. By giving workers formal rights like voting, it gives them the wrong impression that they have an equal share in governance, or that their interests are somehow aligned with the capitalists.
Yes. The source calls these wrong impressions. The system grants formal equality but maintains real economic inequality, and this facade helps legitimize what Marxists see as unnatural and irrational capitalist property relations.
It papers over the cracks.
That's the argument. The source quotes John Maguire saying the state represents workers only illusorily, reflecting their ideological misconception of themselves. This ties into the later idea, especially developed by Antonio Gramsci, of hegemony.
Hegemony, the idea that the ruling class dominates not just through force, but through culture and ideas.
Precisely, making their worldview seem like common sense. Workers consent based on values and ideas shaped by the dominant culture, even if it's ultimately against their material interests, what some might call false consent.
And liberal democracy perpetuates this economic division. It provides suffrage and elections, but doesn't fundamentally alter the relationship between haves and have-nots. The underlying structure remains.
The source points out that liberal societies only grudgingly expanded suffrage when they were confident it wouldn't threaten capitalist property rights. And the source includes a very sharp, very famous quote from V.I. Lenin in State and Revolution.
What did Lenin say?
He called capitalist democracy democracy for an insignificant minority, democracy for the rich, that is, the democracy of capitalist society. Oppressed are allowed every few years to decide which particular representatives of the oppressing classes shall represent and repress them in Parliament.
Wow. That's a pretty brutal dismissal of elections, just choosing which member of the oppressing class gets to oppress you for the next few years.
That's Lenin's perspective presented starkly in the source. For Marxists, as long as class exploitation exists, the political system will inevitably serve the exploiters, making true democracy impossible within capitalism.
Okay, so if liberal democracy is a sham serving the bourgeoisie, what is the Marxist alternative? The source talks about the dictatorship of the proletariat. That term sounds, well, harsh to modern ears.
It definitely does, and it's often loaded with negative connotations. But in the Marxist framework, it's understood very specifically as the domination of society by the working class, the proletariat, after a violent revolution overthrows capitalism.
It's about class domination, not necessarily one person's rule.
Exactly. The source clarifies that Marxists see any state as a form of dictatorship in the sense of class rule. So bourgeois democracy is seen as bourgeois dictatorship, ruled by the capitalist class. The dictatorship of the proletariat is presented as proletarian democracy or socialist democracy, ruled by the working class.
This is not the final stage, but an interim one, a transition.
Exactly. It's presented as a necessary transitional phase to dismantle the capitalist system and its vestiges, suppress counter-revolution, and prepare the way for a classless society and the eventual withering away of the state itself. The term dictatorship here refers to the class nature of state power and the need to use it decisively, not necessarily tyrannical rule by a single person or small group in the popular sense.
The source tries to clarify what this dictatorship means in practice for Marxists, beyond just class rule.
It does. It implies the socialization of major means of production, factories, land, etc., planning production for social needs rather than private profit, guaranteeing rights like work, education, health, and housing, and developing science and technology for collective benefit. It's framed as a system prioritizing the material well-being and rights of the majority working class.
And Henri Lefebvre is quoted saying it means concrete democracy, i.e. the coercive power of a majority over a minority. That's quite direct.
That quote from the source is key to understanding their justification. If democracy is fundamentally about majority rule, then a state where the working class majority dominates the former capitalist minority is presented as more democratic than a bourgeois state where the minority capitalists dominate the majority workers. Coercion is seen as necessary, temporarily, to suppress counter-revolution and eliminate the structures of the former exploiting class.
This is obviously a highly controversial point. The idea that suppressing a minority is a necessary step towards a more democratic outcome for the majority, justifying coercion.
It is. And as the source later presents Lenin's view, he argued the suppression is specifically against the oppressors to liberate humanity from wage slavery. He contended there is no real freedom or democracy in capitalist societies anyway because the bourgeoisie already engages in suppression and violence against the working class through exploitation and state power. So, revolutionary suppression is framed as necessary counterviolence to achieve true freedom for the vast majority.
The source also describes democratic centralism as the organizational principle for the socialist state and the Communist Party. How does that work?
Yes, this is Lenin's principle. It involves elements like elected membership at lower levels, allowing for free discussion initially. But crucially, once a decision is made by the highest body, like the party central committee, it is then rigidly imposed and must be followed by all lower levels without deviation.
So democratic in the input at the base, perhaps, but strictly centralized in adherence to the top decision once it's made. A combination of bottom-up election and top-down command.
That's the dynamic described in the source. It aims for unity and discipline in action after discussion. And again, this dictatorship of the proletariat is seen as a transitional phase. Marx apparently drew on the Roman concept of a temporary dictator appointed during a crisis to achieve a specific goal.
What was the goal?
The state's function is to destroy the existing capitalist state machinery, transfer its functions to new social forces, the working class, and then ideally wither away when a fully rational, classless organization of production becomes possible, making a coercive state unnecessary.
And during this phase, the source notes a radical change in who exploits whom, or rather the nature of exploitation itself.
Yes. It argues that before socialism, the have-nots, workers, peasants, were exploited by the haves, capitalists, landlords. After the revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat, the former haves, capitalists, are in a sense suppressed or controlled by the former have-nots, workers, because property is socially owned. The ultimate goal is that abolishing private property eliminates exploitation entirely, establishing a higher social rationality.
The source quotes Marx suggesting that once classes are abolished, state power, which historically kept producers under the yoke of exploiters, transforms into simple administrative functions, like managing public services, not enforcing class rule.
The idea is that the state as an instrument of class oppression becomes obsolete in a truly classless society. It exists so long as classes exist, aiming to convert everyone into workers and abolish antagonistic class divisions.
So true democracy, for Marxists, can only be fully realized in the classless society of communism, or perhaps imperfectly in the socialist state that represents the working class interest during the transition.
That's the conclusion presented in the source. Marx didn't reject democracy outright. He attacked bourgeois democracy as a distorted, incomplete form. He envisioned true democracy in a classless society, perhaps inspired by Rousseau's idea that true democracy requires homogeneous interests, which are impossible in a class-divided society.
And he anticipated replacing bourgeois democracy with a specific structure, a commune system.
Yes, the source describes this vision, a pyramidal structure of direct democracy. Small, local communities would manage their affairs and elect delegates to larger units, districts, national level. Crucially, these delegates would be bound by instructions from their electors and subject to recall at any time. Highly decentralized, but linked.
Now, the source notes historical attempts at implementing this vision, like in the Soviet Union and China after their revolutions, but states they ultimately failed and attributes this primarily due to the abolition of incentives for better work.
That's the specific reason for the failure of the commune system cited in the source material. It argues that removing individual incentives hampered productivity. The source also notes that socialist systems established elsewhere were often called people's democracies, intending to distinguish them from Western liberal democracies.
People's democracy, it almost sounds redundant, like democracy of the people's people.
The source acknowledges the tautology but explains it was used consciously to signify a distinct type. Conventional Western democracy was viewed by them as procedural democracy, focused mainly on election mechanics and formal rules. People's democracy was presented as substantive democracy, focused on safeguarding the actual material interests and well-being of ordinary people and the working classes, substance over form.
That procedural versus substantive distinction is a really key takeaway from the Marxist section, isn't it? It highlights whether you judge democracy by the rules of the game or by the outcome for the majority.
Exactly. It's a fundamental difference in perspective. And the source returns to Lenin's argument that the dictatorship of the proletariat, despite its suppression of the former ruling class, is actually more democratic than bourgeois democracy because it is democracy for the poor, democracy for the people, and not democracy for the moneybags. The restrictions it imposes are specifically on the exploiter's freedom, seen as necessary violence against the oppressors to liberate humanity from wage slavery.
The argument being that bourgeois societies already use suppression against the working class through economic exploitation and state power. So revolutionary suppression is just turning the tables to achieve true freedom for the majority.
That's the justification presented in the source, yes. A very controversial justification, needless to say.
Let's turn to the critical appraisal of Marxist theory of democracy provided in the source. It acknowledges some positives first, right?
Yes, on the positive side, the source credits Marxist theory with powerfully demonstrating the limitations and drawbacks of liberal democracy, particularly its failure to achieve real equality for the masses, especially economic equality. It arose from the demand for working-class rights and undeniably influenced liberal theory itself, pushing it to accommodate working-class claims and develop welfare states, for example.
So even critics acknowledge its historical impact on shaping liberal democracies for the better by forcing them to respond.
Yes, its critique forced a response and led to changes. However, the critiques of Marxist theory itself, as laid out in the source, are significant and numerous. First, the source argues that Marxist theory effectively rules out the existence of democracy as commonly understood in the West
How so?
by defining the people narrowly as the working class and denying fundamental rights and participation to former capitalists and even the middle class. The state becomes committed to a particular set of interests, not the common good or equal rights of all citizens. This necessitates restricting fundamental freedoms like thought, expression, association, and political opposition.
Because opposition might represent those class enemies.
Precisely. The source concludes this might lead to social justice for the defined group, the proletariat, but is not democracy because it eliminates free choice, pluralism, and the right to dissent outside the prescribed ideology and organization.
That's a fundamental challenge. Can a system that systematically suppresses dissent and entire groups of people be called democratic, even if it claims to act for the majority's material welfare?
The source concludes it cannot, based on a definition of democracy that centrally includes broad individual freedoms and the right to political opposition. Second, the source argues that the dictatorship of the proletariat, in practice, did not deliver on the promise of a classless society. While Marx's vision was arguably benevolent, the actual historical implementations in the 20th century, USSR, China, etc., saw intense internal power struggles, rivalries, and often brutal suppression, even of sincere Marxists who fell foul of the ruling faction.
Not exactly the withering away of the state.
Quite the opposite in many ways. The source cites sociologist McClaver's observations on the Soviet system, noting its extreme centralization, rigid party line control, the facade of unanimous voting, and a power pyramid that ironically resembled the old Tsarist regime. McClaver argued that the official abolition of classes was negated by the emergence of new occupational gradings and status differences tied to party position and bureaucracy.
So the prediction of a temporary phase leading to a stateless, classless utopia didn't match the historical reality, which often saw the consolidation of a new kind of state power and hierarchy.
That's the critique from the source. The dictatorship persisted and developed its own forms of control and inequality. The source notes the eventual collapse of the Soviet system after the end of the Communist Party's monopoly and the introduction of reforms like glasnost, suggesting the system lacked legitimacy or viability without coercion.
And the third major critique presented explains why capitalism didn't collapse as Marx predicted, bringing in Antonio Gramsci and the concept of hegemony. This seems really important for understanding why things didn't go as Marx expected.
Yes, Gramsci offered a crucial alternative explanation for capitalism's resilience, especially in the West. He argued that the dominant class rules, not just through coercion by the state, the police, the army, but perhaps more importantly, through hegemony, its intellectual and moral leadership in the social and cultural spheres.
So it's not just force, but the dominance of ideas, values, and culture that keeps the system going, making the ruling class's way of seeing the world seem like the only natural way.
That's the concept, exactly. The ruling class gains consent from the ruled not just by force, but by making its values, ideas, and assumptions seem like common sense, like the natural order of things. Workers and others internalize values and beliefs about individualism, property, success, etc., that ultimately benefit the ruling class and reinforce the existing system, even if it's against their own objective interests. This cultural and intellectual dominance gives bourgeois civilization its deep resilience.
Which explains why revolutions didn't happen in the most advanced capitalist states, as Marx predicted, because hegemony was stronger there.
That was Gramsci's argument. Revolutions often occurred in less developed countries where the state was perhaps stronger, but civil society and hegemony were weaker. Gramsci suggested that revolutionary strategy needed to prioritize fighting a war of position, undermining this cultural hegemony, changing hearts and minds before attempting a direct political takeover, a war of maneuver. This shifted Marxist focus from purely economic determinism towards the crucial role of culture, ideology, and intellectuals.
Fascinating. So while Marxist theory provided a powerful critique of liberal democracy's flaws and inequalities, its own theoretical solutions and historical implementations faced significant challenges regarding individual freedom, the concentration of state power, and the underestimation of capitalism's cultural resilience through hegemony.
That's what the source's critique emphasizes, that focusing solely on economic transformation isn't sufficient, the predicted outcomes didn't materialize in practice, and the means used often contradicted democratic values.
Okay, this leads us to another perspective trying to grapple with these issues. The radical theory of democracy, represented here mainly by C.V. Macpherson. This theory seems to try and broaden the definition of democracy again, maybe combining elements we've seen in the procedural and substantive views.
Exactly. The source states Macpherson sought to expand the scope of democracy based on observing different political systems around the world in the mid-20th century. In his work, The Real World of Democracy, he argued that Western liberal societies, despite their freedoms and elections, have no exclusive claim to the title democracy. He saw democracy as a much broader concept.
He even suggested that very different types of countries could be considered equally valid democracies if certain conditions were met. That sounds controversial.
Yes, it was. He proposed 3 variants that could potentially qualify. 1, liberal democracy, but needing a more humane touch, implying it needed significant improvements.
Sure.
2, communist countries if they achieved full internal party democracy and opened up their closed, secretive bureaucracies. A big if. 3, third world countries, developing nations at the time, if their governments were legitimized by mass enthusiasm, enjoyed genuine mass support, and demonstrably worked to improve the lives of the masses, regardless of their specific structures or procedures, like multi-party elections.
Wow, that third point is pretty radical. It seems to prioritize whether a government serves and is supported by the masses over its formal democratic structures like competitive elections or civil liberties guarantees. Substance over form, perhaps to an extreme.
It certainly does seem to lean that way. It suggests Macpherson was prioritizing the outcome for the people and their perceived relationship with the government, potentially favoring a substantive view in that context, although his overall aim was more complex, trying to retrieve the original humanist vision of democracy.
He also launched a strong critique against the elitist pluralist approach, what he called the empirical theory, dismissing it as just a market equilibrium system. We touched on this earlier.
Yes, in his Democratic Theory Essays and Retrieval, Macpherson attacked Schumpeter, Dahl, and the underlying utilitarian philosophy he saw behind them. He contrasted this empirical approach, which he saw as value-neutral and descriptive, with the classical traditional theory of democracy, from Rousseau to J.S. Mill. He argued the classical view had a strong moral core, viewing democracy as a developmental process aimed at human emancipation and enabling people to use and develop their unique human capacities.
So classical theory saw democracy as about realizing human potential, becoming fully human, while the empirical view just sees it as a way to manage society and keep the system running smoothly. Essentially saying, whatever mechanism works to maintain this class-stratified society without friction is the best we can hope for.
That's the contrast he draws very sharply in the source. He saw the empirical theory as identifying democracy with a static system that accepts existing power structures, elites, groups, as given and downgrades the fundamental principle of equality. His own theory aimed for a new humanist vision, emancipating individuals from the constraints of the competitive capitalist order to achieve creative freedom. He argued the empirical theory, by focusing on the political market, ignored the fundamental class conflict inherent in a capitalist market society.
He identified 2 underlying elements or assumptions about human nature in Western democratic thought. What were they?
Right. 1 was utility maximization, the view of the human as primarily a consumer of utilities, driven by appetites demanding satisfaction. This, he argued, was central to the rise of capitalism and utilitarianism like Bentham's. The other, which he saw as a more ethical concept, particularly in J.S. Mill's work, was power maximization, but power understood as man being a doer and creator, not just a consumer, developing one's capacities.
Okay, consumer versus creator, and this leads directly to his key distinction between 2 types of power.
Yes, absolutely central to his analysis, developmental power, which he defined as the ability of an individual to use and develop their own capacities creatively to pursue goals they set for themselves. Self-realization, essentially. Extractive power, which is power over others, the ability to use other people's capacities and labor for one's own benefit.
Developmental power versus extractive power. This distinction seems absolutely core to his critique of capitalism and its impact on democracy.
It is. The source highlights Macpherson's argument that capitalism inherently and severely limits developmental power for the vast majority who don't own capital or the means of production. Their labor becomes a commodity bought and sold on the market, and the scale and cost of modern production leave little room for workers to use their skills creatively for their own ends.
You work for the company's goals, not necessarily your own creative fulfillment.
Exactly. Meanwhile, extractive power, the ability to command and benefit from others' labor, becomes the almost exclusive preserve of the owners of land and capital. He argued that the possessive individualism underlying liberal thought, the idea that individuals own themselves and their capacities and owe nothing to society, transforms all social relationships into transactional market relations.
He used an analogy, noted in the source, comparing how we measure the power of a horse or machine simply by the amount of work it can do when commanded versus the human potential for creativity, which he argued is stifled when the demand for work is governed purely by the logic of private profit.
That analogy really drives home his point about capitalism potentially inhibiting human potential. The system values labor primarily for its utility in generating profit for owners, not for its capacity to fulfill the worker's own creative urge or developmental needs.
So, what was McPherson's conclusion about the way forward? If capitalism limits developmental power, what's the alternative?
Well, the source states he actually conceded that existing liberal democracies, for all their faults, were better at preserving civil and political liberties than the existing socialist states of his time. He wasn't advocating for those specific regimes.
Okay, so not a wholesale endorsement of existing socialism.
No. Instead, he advocated for trying to combine socialist ownership of the means of production to curb extractive power with liberal democratic institutions to protect freedoms and enable developmental power. He also recommended expanding the welfare state significantly, allocating essential goods and services based on need, not just market value or desert.
It's an ambitious attempt to merge the supposed benefits of both systems, the economic justice aims of socialism with the political freedoms of liberalism. The source calls it a difficult proposition indeed, acknowledging the huge practical challenge.
It certainly acknowledges the practical difficulty. And the source includes a specific critique from Norman Berry, a political theorist, who argued that McPherson was essentially measuring existing liberal democracy against an unrealistic ideal version of democracy that's probably impossible to achieve in a world of scarcity, rather than comparing it fairly against actual existing alternatives, warts and all.
Which is a valid point, perhaps. It's easy to find flaws in any real-world system when you measure it against a perfect ideal that doesn't exist anywhere.
That's Berry's critique as presented in the source. But McPherson's lasting contribution, arguably, is pushing us to think critically about what democracy could be if it truly focused on fostering human potential and wasn't constrained by economic structures that systematically enabled the extractive power of the few over the many. He really linked economics and human development to the democratic ideal.
Okay, one final theory to explore from the sources. Deliberative democracy. This one seems to shift the focus again. Less on who holds power or the economic structure, and more on how decisions are actually made, the process itself.
Yes, exactly. The source presents this as a more recent development, an attempt to reconcile two key, sometimes conflicting democratic models. Democracy as popular rule, the idea that decisions should reflect the will of the people, and democracy as the bulwark of personal freedom, the idea that decision-making must respect and protect individual liberties.
So, trying to balance what the majority wants with protecting individual rights and freedoms, that's a classic tension in democratic thought.
It absolutely is. Popular rule is concerned primarily with the content of decisions aligning with the popular will, the core idea of people governing themselves, not being ruled by arbitrary officials. Personal freedom, on the other hand, prioritizes the protection of fundamental liberties, freedom of thought, speech, press, assembly, religion, property, the right to vote, freedom from arbitrary arrest, etc.
And this concern for personal freedom is reflected in institutions like
a judicial review, where courts can check laws against constitutional rights, the system of separation of powers, legislative, executive, judicial branches, and checks and balances between those branches. The source also mentions the rule of law here, the crucial principle that everyone is subject to the law, that laws should be clear and applied fairly, protecting citizens against arbitrary government power.
Okay. So how does deliberative democracy try to reconcile popular rule with these protections for freedom?
The core idea, as the source presents it, is that democratic decision-making should embody popular rule, but achieve this through a process that encourages public deliberation on the issues at hand.
So it's not just about adding up preferences through voting or groups battling it out. It's about people actually talking things through.
Precisely. The source emphasizes that it's not envisioned as individuals just fighting for their narrow self-interest, but rather as a process of attempting to persuade others through reasoned argument, appealing to shared values or principles to find a reasonable solution that everyone can ideally accept. It's about justification, not just power or preference.
This sounds like a shift from power or preference aggregation to reason-giving and justification in the public sphere.
It is. It places a strong faith in the capacity for rational discourse and the possibility of reaching better, more legitimate decisions through collective reasoning and mutual persuasion, while still paying careful regard to protecting personal freedoms during that process.
But does this process of being persuaded by others, of changing your mind through discussion, somehow diminish individual autonomy? Are you just informing?
The source addresses this potential concern directly. Defenders of deliberative democracy argue no, because autonomy isn't just about sticking rigidly to your own initial preference in isolation. It's also crucially about having a share in the collective political decisions that affect you and others in the community. Deliberation, they argue, is the very mechanism that makes this shared decision-making authentic and meaningful, rather than just a power struggle.
And it doesn't mean getting rid of professional politicians or representative government entirely. It's not pure direct democracy.
No, not necessarily. The source states it generally involves a division of labor. Citizens participate in public deliberation to supplement the wisdom and expertise of politicians, not necessarily replace them entirely, but crucially, it requires politicians to be constantly and publicly accountable.
How so?
They need to regularly report on and justify their decisions in terms accessible to the public, which in turn provides material for further public deliberation and scrutiny. It's meant to be an ongoing, reasoned conversation.
So it's an ongoing, reasoned conversation between citizens and their representatives, ideally aimed at reaching well-justified decisions that respect both popular will and individual rights.
That's the model, in essence. The source lists key exponents who have developed this theory, names like Michael Walzer, Joshua Cohen, James Fishkin, among others.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from the rather stark idea that power is inevitably held by elites or competing groups, to strong calls for much more active citizen participation, to fundamental critiques based on economic class and structure, to radical calls for combining systems, and now this focus on the quality of public discussion itself. A real journey through different ways of seeing democracy.
It's a whirlwind tour through contemporary democratic theory, for sure, drawing on the rich material we had. And the source provides a particularly useful structured comparison between the elitist and Marxist theories, which really highlights some core disagreements about the nature of power and society. It's worth revisiting briefly as it lays bare such different ways of diagnosing the problems.
Okay, let's quickly revisit that comparison, as it really does lay bare different ways of seeing the fundamental problem of power. They agree on something first, right?
Yes. The source says they both agree that as long as society is divided into ruling and ruled, real political equality isn't secured just by having formal democratic structures like voting. The form isn't enough if the substance of power is unequal. But why it's unequal, that's where they diverge massively.
Okay, how?
Well, first, the nature of domination. Marxists say domination is rooted in the economically dominant class. Political power is just a superstructure built on that economic base. The class that owns the means of production holds the real power. Elitists, on the other hand, say the elite dominates due to natural differences in capabilities and aptitudes. Elites secure power through their special qualities, intelligence, or organizational skills.
So economics versus inherent human traits or skills as the root cause.
Yeah, exactly. Second, their view of the nature of the dominant class. Marxists tend to see a relatively cohesive ruling class, the bourgeoisie, that holds power until overthrown by revolution. Elitists, especially later ones, often see a plurality of elites competing with each other, leading to what Pareto called the circulation of elites, one elite replacing another but never ruled by the masses.
Cohesive class versus competing elites. Got it.
Third, the nature of the social division itself. Marxists see inherently antagonistic classes based on ownership of the means of production, with irreconcilable interests leading to inevitable conflict until a classless society is achieved. Elitists tend to see the elite mass division as almost instinctive and perhaps even complementary, maybe even voluntary, where elites provide leadership and masses provide support, compensating each other for effective social organization. The source provocatively draws a parallel here to Aristotle's justification of slavery as natural.
Antagonistic conflict versus natural, maybe even functional complementarity. Well, those are fundamentally different views of society.
Absolutely. And this leads forth to different views on justice and rationality. For Marxists, the pre-socialist class division is inherently unjust and irrational, based on oppression and exploitation, and justice requires eliminating that division entirely. For elitists, The division is seen as natural, rational, and functional, not inherently involving injustice. Therefore, no revolution is needed to achieve justice, maybe just reforms to ensure elite circulation.
Justice requires revolution versus justice exists within the division. Okay.
Fifth, the scope of social change possible. Marxists believe political domination is alterable because the underlying economic structure, the mode of production, is alterable. A working-class revolution can lead to a classless society, fundamentally changing the power structure. Elitists generally see the domination of an elite as inherent in society, almost unalterable. Change is limited to the circulation of elites, an old, tired elite being replaced by a new, more energetic one, but the basic division between elite and mass remains.
Fundamental change is possible versus only superficial change at the top is possible.
Right. And finally, sixth, their view on the scope of democracy itself. Elitists see democracy as partly realized in liberal society if there's an open elite system, recruitment based on talent, circulation occurs, and if ordinary people can choose the ruling elites regularly through competitive elections. The masses remain largely passive responders. Marxists, as we discussed, see true democracy as possible only in a future classless society where the masses truly rule. In any class-divided society, elections are dismissed as an eyewash, a bourgeois ideology that strengthens bourgeois domination by creating false consent, because political equality, divorced from economic equality, lacks substance.
And the Marxists differentiate democracy under different systems.
Yes, the source outlines their view. Under capitalism, true democracy is impossible due to inherent class exploitation. Under socialism, the dictatorship of the proletariat, it's an interim stage, still involving state coercion against former exploiters, but considered more democratic than bourgeois rule because the majority of proletariat rules. It's a necessary step toward true democracy. Under communism, the final classless stage, with common ownership and production for need, from each according to his ability to each according to his need, the ideal of democracy is considered fully realized.
That comparison really crystallizes how these two major critical theories diagnose the problem of power and the potential for true self-governance so differently. It boils down to economics versus inherent human organizational factors.
It does. And we can see how the other theories we discussed fit into this broader conversation. Participatory democracy pushes back directly against the low participation assumptions of both elitism and pluralism, calling for much more citizen involvement within existing systems, drawing inspiration from Rousseau's Popular Sovereignty, but, as we saw, facing practical critiques about feasibility and potential disruption.
Right. And radical theory, like McPherson's, explicitly critiques the market view of politics found in elitist pluralist thought and directly ties the economic structure, capitalism, possessive individualism, to power dynamics, that developmental versus extractive power distinction, ultimately arguing for fundamental structural change to promote human developmental potential, even suggesting difficult combinations of socialist economics and liberal political freedoms.
Exactly. And deliberative democracy offers a different kind of model, focusing less on structures of power or economics and more on the process, improving the quality of decision-making through reasoned public discussion as a way to bridge the gap between popular will and individual freedom, aiming to enhance legitimacy and accountability within the system, potentially complementing existing representative institutions.
So we've navigated theories that see power inevitably concentrated, theories that emphasize group negotiation as the reality, demands for much more mass involvement, fundamental critiques based on economic structure and class conflict, radical calls for combining different economic and political systems, and ideas focusing on improving the quality of public discussion and reason-giving. It's a complex landscape.
It's a very multifaceted landscape, and the source's overall conclusion is quite a powerful synthesis, I think. It suggests that achieving democracy as an ideal isn't just about getting the political institutions right or just about transforming the economic structure. It's not an either-or.
It's something that needs to be pursued simultaneously across multiple spheres, both hand.
Exactly. The source argues it needs to be pursued in the legal political sphere, establishing and maintaining robust constitutional structures, rule of law, and freedoms. The economic sphere, actively addressing inequality, control over production, perhaps moving towards a more socialist mode, as the source suggests in that specific context when discussing Marxism. And the cultural sphere, cultivating widespread values of human equality, mutual respect, and active participation. All three are needed.
That acknowledges the incredible complexity. It means none of these theories we've looked at hold the single, simple, perfect answer. They offer different diagnoses as the core problem: power concentration, economic inequality, citizen apathy, fundamental class conflict, or a lack of reasoned discourse. And they offer very different prescriptions: more competitive elections, better group bargaining, much more participation, economic revolution, radical structural reform, more deliberation.
They really highlight the persistent, perhaps unavoidable tension between the democratic ideals we often hold, like rule by the people, and the complex, often messy realities of how power is distributed and decisions are actually made in societies. They show that democracy isn't a static destination we've arrived at, but a constantly debated, contested, and redefined aspiration.
And looking at the world through these different lenses can really change how you see everyday politics, can't it? That endless debate about campaign finance reform, it connects directly to the elitist and Marxist critiques about wealth equaling political power. The constant lobbying you see in Washington or London or Brussels, that's the pluralist view of group bargaining in action. Protests in the streets and calls for town hall meetings. That's the demand for more participatory democracy.
Absolutely. Arguments about the minimum wage, corporate power, or universal basic income. They tie directly into the Marxist and radical critiques about economic power and its impact on freedom and democracy, and calls you here for more civil political discourse, for finding common ground. That's the spirit of deliberative democracy trying to find its footing in a very polarized world.
These theories equip you, the listener, with the vocabulary and the analytical frameworks to dig beneath the surface of these events, to ask deeper questions about who truly benefits, who holds sway, and whether the system, whatever form it takes, is genuinely living up to its stated democratic ideals.
It means democracy is always fundamentally a work in progress, an ongoing struggle, a set of ideas constantly being tested, challenged, and redefined by the realities of power, inequality, and social life.
What's fascinating here, looking back at all this, is how despite their radical differences in solutions, theories, as opposed as, say, elitism and Marxism, both pinpoint similar core problems: the stubborn concentration of power and the undeniable potential for economic and social inequality to undermine democratic ideals.
Right.
Their proposed solutions are worlds apart, obviously, but the fundamental challenges they identify, power and inequality, seem to be persistent questions for any society that claims to be democratic.
That's a crucial takeaway. The diagnoses sometimes overlap, even when the prescriptions are utterly incompatible.
So, building on the source's concluding thought that realizing democracy requires simultaneous change in political rules, economic structures, and cultural values, and reflecting on all the tensions we've discussed today, from elite power and group influence to the very real challenges of achieving widespread participation and addressing deep economic inequality. Here is something for you to mull over. If achieving a truly meaningful democracy requires progress in all three spheres, political structures, economic systems, and cultural values, which of these do you think is the most crucial starting point for change in the world you see around you today? And perhaps, just as importantly, where do you see the biggest obstacles to making progress in that area?
Keep observing, keep questioning. These theories give you some tools to do just that.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.